Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Emily Burt.
And I'm Lucinda Rouse. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. This week we'll be exploring the world of charity freelancing and ask what recent trends have to say about the current state of the sector. But first, welcome back, Emily.
Hello.
You left us for 10 months, I was counting, to have a baby. It's wonderful to have you back with us and, of course, back in the studio today.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it didn't take me 10 months to actually have the baby. That happened a little quicker. No, it's wonderful to be back from maternity leave, although, of course, does feel a little bit daunting to be in front of the microphone again for the first time since I went on leave. There's a definite risk that I will spontaneously break into a rendition of Wind the Bobbin Up, but I will make every effort to stay on task.
Excellent, and thanks so much for getting that horrible song in my head.
Sorry.
So this week we will be thinking about a very specific segment of the charity workforce. Consultants, freelancers, external advisors, there are a whole variety of names for them. We're joined for this discussion by one such professional. Alex Evans is a civil society consultant, a role he's held for the past 6 years. And in that time, he's worked with 35 organisations, including Henry Smith Charity, the Venture Foundation and Age UK. Hi, Alex.
Hi, nice to see you. There's plenty of other words that are used for consultants as well, but we'll move on to that, I'm sure.
Slightly less favourable.
That's right.
Well, you have an incredibly broad spectrum of not-for-profit expertise, from research and evaluation to strategy and leadership. I gather your strapline is everything charity. And before embarking on consulting, you held a couple of chief executive roles latterly at the Time and Talents Association in South London. Why did you decide to make the move into freelancing?
That's a really interesting one. And I think, like quite a lot of people, I didn't necessarily make the decision. The decision was sort of made for me. So I've been working very, very hard in the voluntary sector for a very long time. Got to the stage where really I burned out and got to the stage where I had lots of different health problems and so on. I got diagnosed with epilepsy, started having seizures on trains and so on. And so got to the stage where I realized I was just going to have to take some time out. Wasn't really sure what I was going to do next, but once that happened, then people just started saying, oh, well, you know, Alex is around and he's really good, and could we ask him to do this? And from there, 6 years later, I'm still doing things with ups and downs. But yeah, again, it wasn't really necessarily a choice, but it's worked out very well for me for now.
That's really interesting to hear, that the journey that you went on, and we will compare your perspective and your sort of entry with others through a survey that we're going to talk about in just a little bit. But before all that, and before you tell us how you found the past 6 years, I'd like to play an account from a small charity chief executive about why using freelancers works for her organisation.
My name's Georgie Moseley and I'm the founder of the Help Harry, Help Others cancer charity in Birmingham. The charity exists to support adults and children affected by any type of cancer, with over 20 services on site. So my staff team consists of currently just 3.5 employed staff. But then I have a service delivery team, which is a mixture of volunteers and self-employed sessional workers, that consists of probably another 30 to 33 people. The self-employed contracts work really well, both for the charity and the self-employed person. And I'm going to use, for the example of today, our counselling team. If I had an employed team full-time, that team would whittle right down to probably 4 or 5 people because of cost. It enables me to have a more diverse counselling team. They're qualified in specific areas of expertise, and people buy into people, and especially with something so sensitive as counselling, we've got to make sure that not only have we got the right skill set, but we've got the right personal attributes to be a match. And this gives me, more of an offering to go out to our service users with. My role, obviously, as the founder of the charity is to look at doing the best that we can to support not only the service users, but to operate as efficiently and effectively as we can. And this model for us just works well because it's been a quite a turbulent few years since COVID, and there's just so much going on in the world. We are really up against it. So increasing demand of service users reaching out for our support. We're getting lack of public engagement because of people just haven't got the money. And we've got unavoidable rising costs. And with all of these challenges, by having the self-employed people, whether we have busy periods of people reaching out to us, or if we don't get so many clients through, we're able to go with what's happening to us as a charity right now. And if we've got peaks, we give them more hours. And if we're not getting such a demand, then we can decrease their hours. And I must stress that, we do get a discounted rate. So these people are actually giving to charity, but they can't live their lives with not being paid. So we get a good rate, we get the flexibility. I've got a bigger access to a diverse and more skill set within the team, which helps in the current time.
That was Georgie Moseley from the Help Harry Help Others cancer charity. Now, Alex, obviously, Georgie uses freelancers in a slightly different way to your average charity consultant, because the counsellors that she hires and works with are professionals who work across a range of sectors. They're providing their services to her at a discounted rate as well. Listening to that, though, I was very conscious of a number of common themes that we're hearing across the sector at the moment, that rising pressure, the rise in demand. I wonder, from a consultancy, from a freelance perspective, can you relate to any of what she was saying?
I can certainly understand the pressures that people are under. The idea, especially if you're looking at counsellors and so on, that's a very sort of standard route that people take in terms of being freelancers and so on. Something that slightly concerns me is if we're looking at this more broadly across the sector, there's a danger that what we're actually doing is starting to take people who originally would have had fairly secure employment and sort of Uberizing them in a way, or turning them into something like Deliveroo drivers. So yes, I can see that that's really positive for organisations. And of course, we always want to make sure that charities get good value. But I do worry a little bit that what we're actually seeing is a sort of hollowing out of people, professional people in the sector, because of very significant contraction that's happening in that area. Which is not to say, of course, that consultants and freelancers aren't offering a great deal to the sector, and many people choose to do it because it works for them.
And from your perspective, having worked as a consultant for the past 6 years, what are the main pros and cons of freelancing for you?
In some ways, what I've found is the thing that works for me best as a person and as a human being. So one of the things I found, for example, was that I really hated working in an office. I'd never really realised quite how much I disliked it until I wasn't anymore. The thing is, if you put me in an office, I'm sort of like someone sort of left a husky in the house unsupervised. I will eat the furniture. So some of that is actually allowed me to sort of accept what I'm like as a person, and the fact that actually I really like that sense of space that it gives me in a way, and also the ability to think about lots of different things at once, use my creativity, love meeting people and building relationships with people and so on. So it just works for me really well as a person, and it also allows me to use a lot more skills in different ways than I might be able to if I was in a particular specialist role in an organization. And I think if you look at the survey, which we'll go on to later, that seems to be a very common thing that people are experiencing. Another thing that people tend to find is that it allows them to fit it around other commitments. So, for example, you might have caring commitments or childcare commitments and so on, and it allows you to be more flexible in terms of those kind of things if you can. That's really positive for people in all sorts of ways. I think the downsides are, and this is why it doesn't end up working out for a lot of people, the two main things are isolation. So often people end up feeling very isolated as a freelancer. I've been very lucky in the last couple of years to have started to build up a network of people who I know, but prior to that it was very lonely, very isolating. And then the other one I think is universal, which is real uncertainty and precarity, and that anxiety about, is more money going to come in, and do I know whether I'll be able to pay the mortgage this month? And I think a lot of people are in a position where they can have a financial cushion, or for example, they have a partner who has a very steady job or something like that. It makes it a lot easier for you to do it. But if you don't have that, that anxiety and that sense of uncertainty can be very, very strong. And I think a lot of people struggle with that.
Yeah, and it is often when organisations are having to think about their budgets and want to avoid making redundancies at all costs, which sadly so many charities have had to do in the past couple of years. But it's often those freelance budgets that are cut first, isn't it, in order to sort of preserve the central team. And as you say, very, very difficult to plan and to live your life as you want to get your outgoings in order when it's just so precarious.
So, Alex, you were obviously mentioning the survey that we're about to speak on now, which has been conducted for us by the good people at Blume. They're a platform that matches freelancers with charities, and they ran a survey for this episode and surveyed 152 freelancers to find out what their picture is like at the moment. And I think a lot of what came out in these findings really resonates with what you have said. One of the biggest motivations was lifestyle and that need for flexibility. That was a top line finding of this, which goes back to what you were saying a moment ago. Needing that flexibility, needing to have greater control over the ways they work were big elements for freelancers. But crucially, something that really stood out to me was that redundancy was a big factor in this survey. More than 1 in 5 of the freelancers, admittedly a reasonably small sample size, but I do think that is notable, said that redundancy had factored into their choice to move into a freelance space, which I think speaks back to what you were saying about that contraction of the sector. Because as Lucinda said, particularly in the last few years, we have seen so many redundancies across the sector, and they are continuing to happen now as budgets continue to be squeezed and pressures continue to mount financially on charities. On the more positive side, a lot of the freelancers said that going into a freelance lifestyle gave them that greater flexibility, more autonomy over the ways that they work, and a greater variety of work. So it's a bit of a mixed picture, and underpinning it is that slight struggle with uncertainty and that tenuous nature of the work.
Yeah, I think 2/3 of the respondents said that uncertainty was the main downside of working as a freelancer. Very interesting that that's against 86% who enjoy it for their flexibility, but 14% said that money, so actually earning the same or in some cases less than what they were earning when they were in staff positions, was a downside. And 10%, as you cited, Alex, said loneliness. So these findings, is that consistent with what you're hearing within your community of charity freelancers?
I don't know anybody who is working in the way that they're working because they think they'll be paid better. There might be a difference for people who are working part-time, for example. So let's say that you come out of your role in the voluntary sector full-time and you decide that you want to work part-time. If your organisation won't let you work part-time in your current role, let's say you're fairly senior, then you're going to have to go and find a part-time role somewhere else. Those can be very hard to find, but also they tend to be more junior. And of course, then you'll find that you're paid an awful lot less. But if people choose to work freelance, they can do fairly senior work, get paid at a reasonable rate, and actually make it work in some ways. So in those cases, people who want to actually be paid properly for their time and expertise, I can see that makes sense. But nobody is making bank. If we wanted to make a lot of money, we would not be selling services to the charity sector. I think we can be fairly sure. And I think there's this idea that probably comes from the private sector that everyone is spending most of their time on the golf course, you know, and sort of drinking mimosas and the like. And it's just not the case. Really, it's about flexibility and then often about, as I say, push factors as well as pull factors.
Absolutely. And well, I mean, as someone who has just very freshly returned back from maternity leave, and this was my second baby, with certain demographics as well, these push factors are going to be much stronger. So like as a woman, you cannot, and I'm not saying that women do all of the care, but the sad reality is we live in a world where most of the care for kids and dependents still falls to women. You cannot understate that childcare burden. And I'm very lucky to work with an accommodating employer who was happy to accommodate the kind of hours that I need to work in order for me to also be able to care for my kids. But that is not a given. And we live in a world where balancing work and childcare, where most households can't survive on a single income, means that you are having to make cuts, and you can't necessarily do that full-time work. And it was just last week that the ONS said that the average motherhood penalty is costing women about 65 grand by the time their first kid gets to 5 years old. So those push factors are built in on so many structural levels as well. It's not just we're seeing a tightening and a set of redundancies now. There's lots of different factors.
I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think one of the things that we're tending to find is that a lot of that burden is falling on women. But of course, in the charity sector in general, the thing is that in general, it's been seen as a very feminized profession. And so one of the reasons I think that people are paid so poorly in the voluntary sector is because it's feminized and because it's assumed that women do the caring work. And of course, they do it for free because it's not real work, right? So I think there's this real danger that yet again, we're sort of reproducing this gender inequality in the kind of work that we do with people. And I think in some ways, even with freelancing, there's a danger there that what's actually happening is people are having to take on this uncertainty precisely because of the gender gap. But it's not just gender. There's also questions, for example, about people who have health issues. So, for example, that's affected me. There's a lot of people working in the freelance sphere who are neurodivergent, very common, and it works sort of particularly well for them and so on. So I think in general, again, amazing opportunities for flexibility if you need it, but also you need to bear in mind how often people are actually being pushed by structural factors into something which they might not necessarily choose.
And you mentioned the myth of consultants spending much of their time on the golf course. Are there any other common assumptions about freelancers, consultants, whatever you want to call them, that you would like to debunk here?
I think one of those things is people get very anxious about day rates. They think that they look at someone earning however much they earn and they think, well, multiply that by 365 days and that's how much this person is earning. It doesn't work like that. If you think about that more as it's a rule of threes, where in actual fact, a third of that is the amount you would be paid if you were in a permanent role. A third of that is all the things that you don't get. So you don't get a pension, you don't get national insurance contributions from your employer, you don't get holiday pay and sick pay and so on. And then a third of that is the sheer amount of time that you spend actually looking for work. And in some ways, that should be recognizable to charities because that's also how a charity works, right? You don't just pay someone for the time that they're actually there doing the workshop. There is the whole rest of the time with your core costs and all those other things that you need to cover. So I think sometimes people aren't very understanding of the shape of the actual finances of how people who work freelance have to play out. I think the other thing that's interesting is, again, coming back to that thing we were talking about there with caring, there's a real sort of cringe in the voluntary sector about the idea of money and being paid fairly for the work you do. And I think one of the things is that actually when people are PAYE, when you just pay people as staff, you never really see that money in a way. So in some ways, you can almost sort of pretend that it's not really happening and no one has to talk about it. But when someone submits an invoice, there is this moment where suddenly it's like, oh, actually, there's money happening here. And I think there's a bit of projection going on where people say, oh, this person's making money for doing this job. Well, you are too. It's just you don't see it because it goes out every month in a bank account, right? So I think there's often this perception, again, that people are there for greed or something. But I think really, again, not only do the finances of that not stack up, but also that actually this is just sort of projection from a sector who is really uncomfortable about the idea that people might need to be paid fairly for their work.
And just to bring it back to the survey again, on the money front, out of the 152 people who participated in Blume's survey, just over a third said that they earn more than they did in a staff position. Almost half earn the same or less. So I think if you ever need a figure to debunk the myth that consultants are raking it in the charity sector, then there you have it. Alex, you mentioned earlier your concern about the so-called Uberization of particularly senior roles in the voluntary sector. I know that you've written about this as well. Could you tell me a bit about your thoughts on that?
Sure. I still remember now, a few years ago, being at a talk by somebody who was talking about what a wonderful thing portfolio careers were. And I was working in a small charity with vulnerable people around financial inclusion. This person was a sort of, fairly well-off, well-spoken professional lady. She started talking about how everybody should be wanting to have portfolio careers. And I couldn't help thinking, but hold on a minute, I know Mary from down the road does a couple of shifts at Tesco. She does a bit of babysitting if she can. She supplements it with benefits. In a way, she's got a portfolio career, but I don't think she's enjoying this marvelous sense of flexibility or sort of self-actualization that some other people were suggesting. Now, of course, most people who are in senior roles in the voluntary sector, right, because of the demographics of our sector, are not in that position of absolute precarity. But the point is that if we start getting it to the stage where everything is treated a bit like this sort of portfolio career, it does exclude loads of people who might otherwise be able to participate. And again, it made me think of when I see the sort of Deliveroo drivers in Catford, where I live, and I see them hanging around outside a takeaway, waiting for the next pizza. And if they get 2 takeaways, they might be able to actually make it work for the next hour, And of course, if you get it down to the stage where everybody is self-employed and everybody is in these very small piecemeal roles, again, you're looking at not so much flexibility as precarity. So I just have this concern about us moving towards that. And that's happening not just in the voluntary sector, that's happening across our whole economy and our whole culture, right? It's that gig economy thing, which in actual fact may work for you because of your particular position that you're in, but that could change for you, but certainly lots of other people won't be in a position to make it work at all.
I'd like to focus now on a specific portion of the charity freelancer space, specifically fundraisers. And I'd like to ask you why freelance fundraisers are often treated with their own particular suspicion, and the extent to which you think that stems from the attitudes of funders themselves.
The first thing I've got to say is that when I started meeting lots of charity fundraising consultants, I've never met a more values-driven bunch of people in the voluntary sector. I described them at one point as being like the sort of irritating Energizer bunnies, Duracell Energizer bunnies of the sector, because they're just so up for it and they're always striving to get the best for everything. And honestly, the thing is that often it's a bit of a thankless role because, in fact, it involves an awful lot of rejection. But at the same time, the general disdain for fundraising that you get across society is something that also gets projected onto fundraisers themselves in the sector. And given that more and more of them are freelance, often because they've come out of fairly unpleasant environments, they tend to face this quite a lot. And so you do get, for example, people like the National Lottery actually have advice on their website that says that they don't accept bids which have been written by professional fundraisers or freelance fundraisers or consultants. Well, I can tell you that they do, because I would say probably 5 out of 10 of those bids are written by freelance fundraisers. But the question is, you can go ahead and make these systems as complex as they are, expect the amount of work that's being put into these things to be done, and then you can say at the end, well, we don't want anyone to be paid to actually do it. Again, what you're doing is pushing the responsibility away from you, and you're projecting all of this stuff onto this group of people who, be honest, are fairly precarious, doing a really, really hard job, and you're sort of blaming them for a system that you've set up yourself. So it seems like a very strange setup, but also one that, to be honest, I think does a lot to sort of reinforce that power dynamic that you often find between the funder and the funded.
Returning to the Blume survey and to that stat that we're seeing, around 1 in 5 people making this move because of redundancy, and are saying, that they were loosely considering freelancing, and then redundancy was the thing that sort of tipped them into that way of working. And your observation on this Uberization of senior roles and the increasingly kind of gig economy-esque way that the sector is working, and that there are now more consultants than ever. If we assume that this trajectory is going to continue in the current direction, and we're going to see more and more people being made redundant from their full-time roles. Again, in the survey, a decent proportion said that they wouldn't want to go back into full-time work. 2/3 would not return to a full-time charity role anyway. What do you think this growing number of consultants ultimately means for the sector? And is there anything that organisations collectively we should be doing now to try and arrest this trajectory? Is there anything we can do?
If it continues like this, the problem you're going to find is that you don't have any senior professional people left in the sector. because at some point you're going to find that it doesn't really work for people anymore, and you will start losing people from the sector and losing those skills. You also lose institutional memory and organizational memory, and you'll get to the stage where in some ways you might go back to something like the voluntary sector as it was 50 or 100 years ago, where essentially all the quote professional people with high level skills are doing it voluntarily or in sort of piecework and so on. But most of those people are only people who can actually afford to do that. So again, you'll go back to that age old sort of class structure that you find in charity. So that's one of the things that really worries me. I think it's really important to reinforce that having that flexible workforce who are enjoying doing what they're doing and able to sort of self-actualize in that way that we all hope we can do with our work and so on is really positive for the people who work that way. And it's always good to have a flexible workforce. But at the same time, the point is choice. And if people don't have choice, and if they don't have the option to actually work in a way which is secure and where they have full rights of an employee and so on, that's actually quite unjust. So I think at the end of the day, it probably reduces the amount of essentially fairness in terms of the workforce in our sector if people are pushed into that. Whereas at the same time, I know lots of people who are really enjoying working with consultants, lots of consultants who are really enjoying doing it. That's great. But the point is choice. If it's not there, there's a real danger that we're going to hollow out professionals in the sector, much as it might be cheaper for charities.
There's potentially a bit of a trade-off there, though, isn't there? Because I think it's quite telling that finding that 2/3 of respondents to this survey said that they would not return to a full-time charity role, and a further 8% said that it was unlikely that they would be. So for many, this is a really positive development. People saying they found it immensely satisfying. It turbocharged the experience that they gained in the charity sector. They felt they were able to have more impact and learn more than they had previously expected to, expanded their knowledge, and so on. Like you say, choice is important, but with choice, that presumably means that there needs to be an adequate number of full-time or at least PAYE employed positions. And if you have those on offer, then doesn't that reduce the potential freelance opportunities that are out there?
I'm not sure it does, because we're talking about quite a large number of people. And I think at the end of the day, any labour market, if you're looking at it in those terms, always has a mixture of different types of actors in it, or people who are delivering things. So I don't think it necessarily does, because I don't think really there's scarcity. I think having plenty of paid full-time roles or flexible but permanent roles and so on is a really positive thing. And there will always be people who want to be freelance, want to have that flexibility and so on. And that means that people who want to do it can do it, whereas people who don't want to do it can actually get a job. So I don't really think it's a real issue, certainly not at the moment. I think someone said in the survey that the fact that loads of people are being pushed into this actually is unhelpful for everyone, really, because what you end up with is people who actually are in this because they really enjoy it and it really works for them, finding themselves competing with people who are just forced into it in a way. Neither of those people actually benefit particularly from that level of competition, I guess. But at the same time, look, I think it's really important to stress just all those things you mentioned there about just how fulfilling and how positive that experience can be, both for the consultants themselves, but also for the organisations they build relationships with.
Alex, as a final question for you, you've been in this game for over 5 years. What are your thoughts as somebody who's been working as a charity consultant on how organisations can foster successful relationships and make the best and most responsible use of their freelancers?
Perhaps the most important thing is to bear in mind that this is a partnership. If you can actually build a relationship with someone, consultants actually and freelancers are usually very good at building relationships with people of trust, because you have to get in there quickly and do that. If you can actually have this trusting relationship where you realize that you are equals and you are coming here to actually achieve something together, that's when the magic happens, right? That's when you get really, really positive outcomes. And I think also There's something about having someone from outside your organization who can come in. They have no stakes in the game in terms of the organization itself, but they're actually able to take part and really support you to move things on. That is a very powerful thing, and something that people sometimes don't recognize the value of. So I think building those relationships, and then also the power of someone from outside, this sort of external person who can bring fresh perspectives, maybe fresh skills, fresh knowledge and so on, but also just a sense of real partnership, that you're working together to do things. I think that's what you need from freelancers. And I think when it doesn't work is when people treat freelancers either like cheap labor, or they treat people like some kind of guru or something, or someone who is this external person who's going to come in and want to do their magical thing and take things over and so on. That doesn't happen either. You know, those people don't get much work, let's be honest, right? So I think it's really about treating it as a relationship between an organization and a human being who is skilled at what they do, and trying to find a way of making great things happen together. And it's all about the relationship.
Well, Alex, it's been such a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you for such a thought-provoking discussion.
Thank you so much, Alex.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Alex. If you have any thoughts on it, please do get in touch. We love hearing from you, and our listener survey is always open. And that's it for this episode. Next week, we'll be hearing from Prostate Cancer UK's Chief Executive, Laura Kirby. Do join us for that. But for now, from all of us at Third Sector, thank you so much for listening. Our producers are Jude Owen and Nav Powell.